My name is Alice. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe with soft words: reliable, easygoing, the one who doesn't make a fuss. I work a steady job, pay my bills on time, and keep my promises. I don't raise my voice. I don't fight for attention. And because of that, people often assume I don't notice much at all. They're wrong about that part. I've always been underestimated. Not in a dramatic way, not with insults or open cruelty. It's subtler than that. I'm the person conversations move past, the one whose name is used without permission, whose time is volunteered before I'm asked, whose silence is mistaken for agreement. If you asked my family how they'd describe me back then, they would probably say, Alice is fine with it, or Alice won't mind. And for a long time, I didn't correct them. This story isn't about rage. It's not about revenge. And it's definitely not about humiliating anyone. It's about something much quieter and, I think, much more common. It starts with a letter, a plain envelope from the local tax authority addressed to me. Inside was a bill for a piece of land I had never seen, never visited, and never agreed to buy. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error. Those things happen. But as I read the details, line by line, a slow, unsettling truth emerged. My family had used my name to buy land. I hadn't signed anything knowingly. I hadn't benefited from it. The property wasn't mine, but the debt legally was. That moment didn't explode my life. It compressed it. Everything I thought I understood about trust, obligation, and my role in my own family collapsed inward, quietly, like a building being emptied from the inside. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey that followed. Not just the discovery itself, but the years leading up to it, the patterns I ignored, the role I was trained to play, and the calm decisions that changed everything afterward. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no shouting matches, no sudden strokes of luck. Just paperwork, memory, patience, and the slow realization that being quiet does not mean being powerless. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I think many people live versions of it. Stories where boundaries are crossed politely, where harm arrives wrapped in familiarity, where accountability only appears when someone finally stops absorbing the cost. If you've ever been the dependable one, the reasonable one, the person who's expected to carry things without complaint, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever looked back at a moment and realized that what you called keeping the peace was actually you paying a price no one acknowledged? To my family, I was never the loud one. I wasn't the rebel, the visionary, or the problem child. I was the steady one, the one who answered calls, the one who filled out forms correctly, the one who remembered deadlines, birthdays, and which documents needed copies. If something needed to be handled without drama, it usually landed in my lap. They didn't say this outright, but it lived in the way they spoke to me. Conversations with me were practical, never emotional. Requests came wrapped as assumptions. You're good with paperwork. You don't mind helping. You're better at this stuff than we are. Compliments that sounded like trust, but functioned more like assignments. At family gatherings, I wasn't ignored. I was used efficiently. Someone would slide a folder toward me at the kitchen table. Someone else would ask if I could just take a look at something later. My name moved easily through rooms, detached from my presence, as if it represented a service rather than a person. And I played along, not because I was afraid, but because I genuinely believed this was what love looked like in our family. Contribution equaled belonging, reliability equaled respect. If I didn't complain, no one was upset. If no one was upset, then everything was fine. That's what I told myself. Looking back, I see how carefully my role was shaped. I was never asked what I wanted to do, only whether I was available. Never consulted emotionally, only operationally. When disagreements happened, I was brought in to smooth them over, to explain things, to translate tension into neutral language. I became a buffer without realizing it. What's important is this: none of it felt abusive at the time. There were no raised voices, no threats, no dramatic betrayals, just a slow, consistent positioning. I was the one who would handle it, the one who wouldn't make it complicated, the one who wouldn't say no. Invisibility doesn't arrive all at once, it accumulates. I remember once, years before the land purchase, overhearing a relative say, Alice doesn't really need much. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was said casually, almost fondly, but it landed somewhere deep. I realized then that I had become easy to overlook because I had trained everyone to expect very little resistance from me. Still, I didn't resent them. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was emotional intelligence. I thought choosing calm over confrontation made me evolve. What I didn't understand yet was that calm, when unchosen, becomes permission. I paid my own rent. I stayed within my means. I avoided debt because it scared me. I read contracts carefully. I tracked expenses. Financial responsibility wasn't something I announced. It was just how I lived. Ironically, that made my name useful. Clean credit, no noise, no questions. To them, I was safe. And when people see you as safe, they sometimes forget you're human. If you had asked me then who I was in my family, I would have said, I'm the dependable one. I would have said it with pride. I didn't know that dependability, unguarded, can quietly turn into entitlement on someone else's part. I wasn't invisible because they hated me. I was invisible because I made it easy. That realization didn't come until much later. At this point in the story, I still believed I was choosing my role freely. I still believed silence was neutral. I still believed that being needed meant being valued. I was wrong, but not in a way that screamed, in a way that whispered. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's why it stayed with me. It was a conversation I wasn't supposed to be part of. I was in the next room sorting mail at my parents' house when I heard my name said in that particular tone, casual, practical, already decided. Someone was talking about paperwork. Someone else laughed softly and said, Alice will handle it. She always does. No one asked me. No one checked if I had time. My name was used the way you'd use a tool you were familiar with, confident it would work the same way it always had. When I walked back into the room, the conversation shifted. They smiled. Someone explained briefly what they needed help with. It was framed as a favor, but the decision had already been made. I remember nodding automatically, my body agreeing before my thoughts caught up. That was the first small cut, not because helping was wrong. I had helped 100 times before. But something about that moment felt misaligned. Like I had been volunteered for something I hadn't even heard of yet. Like my consent was assumed rather than requested. I told myself I was overthinking it. That became a pattern. Small moments followed. Documents were placed in front of me with tabs already marked. Conversations that began mid sentence, as if I had already agreed. Jokes about how I was the responsible one were said in a way that ended the discussion rather than invited it. Each instance was minor. Each one is easy to dismiss. And that's exactly what everyone else did. If I hesitated, someone would say, "It's no big deal." If I asked a question, someone would reply, "We've always done it this way." If I looked uncomfortable, someone would add, "You're better at this than we are." There was no malice in their faces, just relief. Relief that they didn't have to deal with it themselves. What I noticed, what I couldn't unsee once I started paying attention, was how quickly my boundaries dissolved in group settings. Not through force, but through momentum. Decisions moved forward smoothly as long as I stayed quiet. If I slowed things down, even slightly, the energy in the room shifted. Not anger, impatience. And I hated that feeling. So I learned to swallow the discomfort and move on. I told myself this was adulthood, this was family, this was cooperation. But I remembered every instance. There was one afternoon, not long after that first overheard conversation, when someone casually asked for a copy of my ID just in case. The reason sounded reasonable. It always did. I handed it over without thinking too hard, then felt a strange tightness in my chest later that night. I couldn't explain why. Nothing bad had happened. Not yet. Still, I wrote it down in my notebook. Just a line. A date. Who asked? Why? I didn't know then that this habit, quiet documentation, would become important. At the time, it was just a way to settle my mind. Proof that I wasn't imagining things, that something had shifted, even if I couldn't name it. Everyone else moved on easily. That was the hardest part. They forgot these moments as soon as they passed. For them, it was background noise. For me, each one left a faint mark, not painful enough to demand action, just sharp enough to change how I stood in the room. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. Outwardly, nothing changed. I was still helpful, still calm, still dependable. But internally, something had begun to separate. I started noticing how often my agreement was assumed, how rarely my limits were checked, how easily responsibility slid in my direction when things became inconvenient or risky. The first small cut wasn't about what they took, it was about what they stopped seeing. They stopped seeing me as someone who needed to be asked. And once that happens, it becomes very easy for everyone else to keep going. Once something happens more than once, it starts to feel like a pattern. Once a pattern repeats without consequences, it starts to feel like a rule. I didn't wake up one day and decide to accept less. I adjusted quietly, incrementally, the way people do when they're trying to stay reasonable. After that first small cut, similar moments followed with such consistency that they lost their sharpness. My name continued to be used as shorthand for compliance. If there was a form that needed signing, someone would say, "Alice can explain it." If there was a decision that required patience and follow through, it was assumed I'd take it on. I told myself I was being trusted, that this was respect, not entitlement. But respect asks. Entitlement assumes. Still, I stayed silent. Not because I didn't notice, but because speaking up felt disproportionate. How do you challenge something that's invisible to everyone else? How do you explain discomfort when no one else sees a problem? Every time I considered saying something, I imagined the response: confusion, reassurance. You're reading too much into it. We didn't mean it like that. Of course, we appreciate you. And I believed them, or at least, I believed that they believed it. So I normalized it. I became skilled at rationalization. I told myself they were stressed, that it was temporary, that families operate on unspoken understandings. That being flexible was a strength. I reminded myself that no one was forcing me. But consent given under expectation doesn't feel like consent for long. I began to notice how the requests were framed less and less as questions. Can you help with this? Became, when you do this. Time frames were decided before I was consulted. My calendar was treated as expandable. My resources, time, attention, even my identity, felt increasingly available to others by default. What disturbed me most wasn't the behavior itself. It was how normal it had become. At gatherings, someone would say, Alice will know, and everyone would nod. When paperwork was involved, eyes would turn toward me automatically. I could have stepped back. I could have redirected. But by then, my silence had become part of the system, and systems resist change. I noticed something else too: the emotional distance. Conversations with me stayed practical. No one asked if I was tired, or overwhelmed, or uncomfortable. My role didn't require feelings, only function. The more reliable I became, the less curiosity there was about my inner world. That's when the wound deepened, not loudly, not catastrophically, just enough to teach me that my value, in their eyes, was conditional. As long as I remained useful, everything was smooth. As soon as I hesitated, even internally, friction appeared. So I learned to keep my hesitation private. I continued writing things down: dates, names, context. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because memory is fragile when everyone else insists nothing is happening. My notebook became a quiet witness, a place where my experience stayed intact, even when it wasn't acknowledged. I told myself this was temporary, that eventually things would rebalance, that surely someone would notice how much I carried. They didn't. Normalization does something dangerous. It makes you doubt your right to object. Once a behavior becomes routine, challenging, it feels like breaking an unspoken contract. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be seen as selfish. I didn't want to disrupt the calm I had worked so hard to maintain. So I paid the cost instead. I absorbed the extra responsibility, the assumed availability, the quiet pressure to remain agreeable. And because I did it without complaint, the expectation solidified. No one thanked me for that. They didn't think they needed to. By the time I realized this wasn't cooperation anymore, but quiet erosion, I had already been positioned as the person who would always say yes. And once you're in that position, the most dangerous thing you can do is finally notice. Roles don't always come with announcements. No one gathers everyone in a room and says, "This is who you are now." Most of the time, they form through repetition, convenience, and silence. By the time I understood the role I had been assigned, I was already performing it flawlessly. I was the reliable one, the fixer, The person who would step in when things became complicated, uncomfortable, or tedious. I wasn't asked to lead, but I was expected to support. I wasn't invited into decisions early, but I was brought in at the end to make them work. It took me a long time to realize how carefully this role protected everyone else from effort, from accountability, from risk. When something went smoothly, it was collective. When something required precision or responsibility, it became mine. If paperwork needed to be filed correctly, if deadlines mattered, if someone needed a calm voice to explain things to an institution, I was summoned, not formally, casually, as if it were natural, and because I complied, the role hardened. I noticed how rarely I was consulted about outcomes. My job was execution, not authorship. Plans were made without me. Decisions were agreed upon elsewhere. I was looped in once there was something to handle. It felt efficient to them. To me, it felt like being trusted with consequences, but not with choice. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that clarified everything. Someone said, half joking, "We'd be lost without Alice." Everyone laughed. I smiled. But inside, something went cold. Because I understood then what they meant. They didn't mean emotionally lost. They meant logistically stranded. No one followed that statement with concern about my limits, my consent, or my well being. They didn't need me. They needed my function. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The role came with expectations I had never agreed to. That I would remain calm no matter what. That I would be available. That I would absorb stress without transmitting it back. That I would fix quietly and disappear afterward. And I upheld it because breaking character felt dangerous. When you are the stable one, any sign of resistance is treated as instability. Any boundary is misread as betrayal. I sensed that if I pushed back, even gently, the narrative would shift. I would become difficult, overreacting, not herself. So I stayed myself, at least the version of myself they preferred. I didn't confront them because confrontation would have required them to acknowledge the role. And acknowledging the role would have required change. Change is inconvenient when things are working for you. Instead, I watched. I watched how my name was used in my absence. I watched how responsibility slid toward me when risk appeared. I watched how easily others relaxed once I was involved. And I began to understand something important. Roles don't just limit the person inside them, they enable the people around them. My role made things easier, cleaner, less stressful, which meant there was no incentive to reconsider it. This wasn't cruelty, it was comfort. But comfort, built on someone else's quiet labor, carries a cost. I didn't yet know what that cost would be. I only knew that it was accumulating, that something unsustainable was being asked of me, not all at once, but steadily. At this point in the story, nothing had exploded. No one had crossed a line that was obvious enough to point to. Everything was still wrapped in politeness and family familiarity. But the role had been assigned, and once a role exists, the next step is expectation. That was coming. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a crisis. No one said anything that day that was particularly cruel. That's what made it so clear. I was alone when it happened, sitting at my small kitchen table early in the morning, a mug of coffee going cold beside me, my notebook open but untouched. I wasn't upset. I wasn't even thinking about my family in any deliberate way. I was just quiet. And in that quiet, something rearranged itself. I realized I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Not physically, emotionally, structurally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from holding a shape you didn't choose for too long. I saw with sudden clarity that my calm wasn't always generosity. Sometimes it was avoidance. Sometimes it was fear of being misunderstood. Sometimes it was the easiest way to keep moving without disruption. But that morning, the cost of that calm finally became heavier than the discomfort of change. I looked at my notebook, all those dates, all those small moments I had recorded without knowing why. They weren't dramatic on their own, but together they told a coherent story. A story where I was consistently positioned as a resource, not a participant. A story where my silence had been interpreted as consent. And the most unsettling realization of all, no one had forced this on me. I had allowed it. That wasn't self blame, it was the agency returning. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why they behaved the way they did and started asking why I had made it so easy. Why had I been more afraid of being seen as difficult than of being quietly depleted? Why I believed that harmony required my constant flexibility. Nothing external changed that day. No phone call, no message, no confrontation. Just an internal decision that clicked into place with surprising calm. I decided that silence would no longer be automatic, not loud resistance, not emotional declarations, just intention. I didn't suddenly say no to everything. I didn't pull away. Outwardly, I was the same. But internally, I stopped performing the role unconsciously. Every agreement would now be chosen, not assumed. Every request would be evaluated, not absorbed. That was the shift. It was subtle, but it changed the axis of my life. I began to pause before responding, to say, let me check, instead of sure, to ask clarifying questions, not to challenge, but to slow momentum. I noticed how often those pauses made others uncomfortable, how quickly people tried to fill the silence with reassurance or urgency. They weren't used to waiting for my consent. And that told me everything. I also noticed how nothing collapsed when I hesitated. The world didn't end. No one got angry. Plans adjusted. Alternatives appeared. The role I had believed was essential turned out to be optional. That realization was both relieving and painful. Relieving because it meant I wasn't as trapped as I thought. Painful because it meant I had been carrying weight that wasn't mine. That day didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I understood then that if something truly serious ever happened, something with real consequences, my family would move forward based on the patterns already established. Patterns where my name could be used, where my reliability could be leveraged, where my silence would be interpreted as approval. I didn't yet know what form that would take, but I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to be ready. So I kept my notebook closer. I read more. I learned more. I stopped dismissing my own discomfort as overthinking. I trusted it as information. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was disciplined. And once it happened, there was no going back to who I had been before. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an automatic smoothing of edges, a way to keep everything moving without friction. Now, it has become deliberate. I spoke less, but with more intention. I agreed less quickly. I listened more carefully. And interestingly, no one noticed the difference at first. They still saw me as quiet, still saw me as agreeable. They didn't realize that the silence they were used to was no longer passive. It was observational, strategic. I stopped filling gaps in conversations. When someone trailed off, expecting me to step in and resolve things, I let the pause linger. When a plan was discussed around me without directly including me, I didn't volunteer. I waited to be asked. Most of the time, the ask never came. That alone was revealing. I also became more selective about what I shared. I answered questions, but I stopped offering extra information. I didn't announce my thoughts unless they were requested. It wasn't withdrawal, it was containment, a quiet reclaiming of my inner space. People often mistake reduced visibility for reduced awareness. They assumed I was still on autopilot, that I would continue absorbing responsibility without question. Their comfort with that assumption gave me room to watch how things truly worked. And what I saw was this: silence, when chosen, unsettles people who are used to benefiting from it unconsciously. Small signs appeared. Slight impatience when I asked for clarification. Subtle surprise when I didn't immediately say yes. A momentary pause when I responded with, "I'll think about it." Nothing explosive. Just enough to confirm that my previous behavior had been taken for granted. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain myself. Explanation invites negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating my awareness. Instead, I focused on learning. I started reading about financial responsibility, liability, and consent. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because I wanted to understand the systems that govern obligation. I learned how names are used, how credit works, how can legal responsibility exist without benefit. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. I reviewed my own records, checked my credit reports, organized my documents, ensured I understood exactly where my name appeared and where it didn't. Everything was clean. At least, that's what it looked like then. Outwardly, I was still the same Alice, same job, same demeanor, same calm presence at family events. No confrontations, no announcements. Inwardly, I'd stepped out of the role without making noise. And that's the thing about roles. They persist only as long as you perform them. Once you stop reinforcing them, even quietly, cracks appear. Others begin to adjust, often without knowing why. Some family members became more direct with me. Others became slightly distant. A few seemed confused, as if something they relied on was no longer responding in the same way. But no one asked me what had changed. They didn't need to. As long as things still worked for them, there was no reason to question it. What they didn't realize was that my silence was no longer cushioning their decisions. It was no longer absorbing risk. It was simply watching. And in that watching, I noticed patterns I had missed before. How quickly plans accelerated once paperwork was involved. How casually my name was mentioned in contexts that carried weight. How often "it'll be fine" was used in place of certainty. I didn't intervene. I let the patterns reveal themselves fully. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It's presence without exposure. And in that space, I began to understand the true shape of what I was standing inside. I didn't yet know what would break, but I knew exactly where to look when it did. While everything looked the same on the surface, something else was happening underneath. No one noticed because nothing about me appeared urgent. I didn't withdraw. I didn't confront. I didn't change my tone. From the outside, I remained exactly where I had always been, steady, quiet, unthreatening. That was the advantage. What they never noticed was how methodical I had become. I began documenting not just moments, but structures. Who initiated what? Who benefited? Who carried responsibility when something went wrong? I stopped asking whether things were fair and started observing whether they were balanced. Most of the time, they weren't. I also started educating myself with precision, not in bursts of anxiety, but in calm, scheduled time. I learned how property ownership works, how titles are recorded, how tax liability is assigned, how debt attaches to names rather than intentions. I learned how easily responsibility can be separated from benefit, and how often that separation goes unnoticed until it's too late. This wasn't suspicion aimed at anyone in particular. It was systems literacy. I made sure my financial records were immaculate. I reviewed my credit monthly. I froze and unfroze access as needed. I organized digital and physical copies of every important document I had ever shared. I noted when and why I had shared them. The notebook evolved. It wasn't just memory anymore, it was a timeline. Dates lined up, requests clustered, patterns sharpened. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that my reliability had positioned me as a low resistance option in situations that carried risk. Not because anyone thought I deserved harm, but because they believed I wouldn't push back. That belief is powerful. I also noticed something else: how little interest there was in my understanding of decisions that involved me. I was told outcomes, not rationales. Assured things were handled, but not shown how. Whenever I asked neutral questions, nothing confrontational, answers stayed vague. That's already sorted. You don't need to worry about that. It's all under control. Those phrases are comforting, unless you're the one whose name might be attached. I didn't challenge the vagueness. I let it exist. Because vagueness reveals confidence when someone has nothing to hide, and defensiveness when they do. At the same time, I began quietly positioning myself. Not dramatically, just responsibly. I made sure my emergency fund was solid, that my job stability was strong, that I could withstand unexpected financial pressure without collapsing. I wasn't planning an exit. I was building resilience, and I kept my silence intact. The truth is, people are rarely cautious around those they believe won't resist. My calm presence disarmed scrutiny. My history of cooperation created trust, misplaced, but genuine. That trust allowed things to move forward without oversight. If I had become visibly suspicious, things might have tightened. If I had confronted early, the behavior might have changed just enough to obscure the truth. But by staying exactly as I was, outwardly, I allowed the full shape of the situation to form. I didn't know then what specific event would expose it. I only knew that when it arrived, I would recognize it. What they never noticed was how my quietness had shifted from accommodation to awareness. That the same traits they relied on, patience, attention to detail, emotional restraint, were now being used to protect me, not them. There's a kind of power in being underestimated. It gives you time, it gives you information, it gives you the ability to act from clarity rather than reaction. I wasn't waiting for revenge. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply refusing to be unprepared again. When the moment finally came, and it didn't shock me. It confirmed everything. The reveal didn't come with drama, no argument, no confession, no sudden realization sparked by intuition or coincidence. It came in the mail, a plain envelope, government letterhead. My name typed cleanly at the top, spelled correctly, no room for ambiguity. I remember standing by the door, keys still in my hand, flipping it over once, then twice, wondering why something so ordinary had made my chest tighten. I assumed it was routine, a notification, a mistake. That assumption lasted until the second paragraph. The letter referenced a parcel number I didn't recognize, followed by an address I had never lived at, never visited, never agreed to purchase. Then came the line that slowed everything down. Outstanding property tax due. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same one where months earlier I had felt that quiet internal shift, and read the letter carefully, not emotionally, precisely. I checked the dates, the amounts, the legal language, and then I saw it. The ownership record. My name, not as a beneficiary, not as an occupant, as the legally responsible party. The property wasn't mine, but the debt legally was. That sentence didn't feel real at first. It sat in my mind like an error message. I reread it, expecting clarity to emerge if I just stared long enough. Instead, understanding arrived slowly, assembling itself from everything I had already documented. The copied ID, the casual requests, the paperwork I had helped with, the decisions were made without me. None of it was accidental. Still, I didn't panic. That surprised me most. I felt something closer to confirmation than shock. A quiet alignment between what I had sensed for years and what now existed in black and white. My hands were steady as I placed the letter beside my notebook and opened my laptop. I didn't call anyone. I haven't asked questions yet. I verified. I searched public records, cross-referenced parcel numbers, confirmed filing dates. Every source said the same thing. The land had been purchased years earlier. My name had been used as the responsible party. The tax liability had accumulated quietly, and no one had told me. The benefit, whatever it was, had gone elsewhere. The obligation had come to me. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, not frozen, just still. This was the moment where anger would have been understandable, where confrontation would have been justified, where emotional reactions could have taken over. But anger clouds accuracy, and accuracy was what I needed. I thought back to every time someone had said, "It's taken care of." Every time I had been told not to worry. Every time my reliability had been treated as a safety net rather than a choice. And I understood something crucial. If I reacted loudly now, the narrative would shift. It would become about misunderstanding, about intentions, about family conflict. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was documentation. So I stayed quiet. I made copies of everything, digital and physical. I noted timelines. I reconstructed how the decision must have unfolded without me. I identified exactly where my consent had been assumed and where it had been legally represented. This wasn't about betrayal in the emotional sense. It was about exposure. The system had worked exactly as designed. It had attached responsibility to the person least likely to resist it, me. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind was organizing. Options appeared, paths diverged. Some involved confrontation, some involved withdrawal, some involved absorbing the cost and moving on. Only one was irreversible, and that was the one I chose to prepare for. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel devastated. I felt clear. For the first time, the story wasn't something happening to me. It was something I could respond to with full awareness. I closed my notebook, placed the letter inside, and labeled the page carefully. This was no longer a feeling, it was a fact. Once the facts were clear, the noise disappeared. That's something people don't talk about enough. How clarity can quiet even the most painful situations. When uncertainty ends, emotion stops thrashing and starts lining up behind logic. I had options, several of them. I could confront my family immediately, sit everyone down, place the documents on the table, and demand explanations. That path would be loud, emotionally charged, and, most importantly, contaminated. The story would shift from what happened to how everyone felt about it. Intentions would be debated. Memory would be selective. Responsibility would blur. I could quietly pay the debt and detach, absorb the loss, chalk it up to experience, and walk away with my peace intact. But my boundaries still unspoken. That option tempted me for exactly 5 minutes, until I realized it would complete the pattern rather than end it. I could ask for repayment, negotiate, or hope for accountability. That required trust in a system of fairness that had already failed once. It also assumed that those involved would suddenly act against their own comfort. Or I could choose the option that didn't rely on anyone else changing, the irreversible one. That decision didn't come from anger. It came from pattern recognition. I looked at the timeline in my notebook and asked myself a simple question. If I handle this quietly for them, what happens the next time my name is useful? I already knew the answer. This wasn't just about land or taxes. It was about consent, agency, and the quiet assumption that I would always absorb consequences to keep things smooth. So I chose the path that ended that assumption permanently. I decided not to warn anyone, not as punishment, as protection. I consulted professionals, not emotionally, but procedurally. I asked neutral questions. I learned exactly what my responsibilities were, and, just as importantly, what they were not. I clarified my rights. I understood timelines, notices, and outcomes. I did nothing impulsive. Every step was deliberate. What made this decision difficult wasn't fear, it was grief. Grief for the version of my family I thought I had. Grief for the trust I believed was mutual. Grief for the person I had been, who would have handled this quietly to spare everyone discomfort. But that version of me no longer existed. Choosing the irreversible option meant accepting that relationships would change, that there would be confusion, that I would be misunderstood, that my calm would no longer protect anyone but myself. I sat with that reality for days, and every time I hesitated, I returned to the facts, to the letter, to the undeniable truth that my name had been used without my informed consent, that my silence had been interpreted as permission, that continuing to absorb this would teach everyone, including myself, that this was acceptable. It wasn't. So I committed, not emotionally, logistically. Once the decision was made, something unexpected happened. The weight lifted. Not because the problem was solved, but because it was finally mine to handle on my terms. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped imagining apologies that hadn't been offered. I stopped hoping for understanding before action. Hope is not a strategy. Clarity is. From that point forward, everything I did followed a single principle. No more silent sacrifice. No more unearned access. The path ahead would be quiet, slow, almost invisible. And by the time anyone else realized what was happening, there would be nothing left to negotiate. Once the decision was made, there was nothing to announce. That was the strange part. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same routines, same tone in my voice, same polite presence at family gatherings. If anyone was watching for signs of conflict or rebellion, they would have seen none. Because real change rarely announces itself, I began moving in silence, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for process. Loud actions invite interference. Quiet ones move cleanly through systems. I handled the immediate obligation first, not by paying blindly, but by stabilizing the situation. I confirmed deadlines, ensured no penalties escalated unnecessarily. I treated the debt like a leak I needed to contain before addressing why the pipe had burst. Every interaction was professional, detached. I didn't explain my family situation. I didn't dramatize. Institutions respond best to clarity, not emotion. At the same time, I documented everything: calls, emails, reference numbers, dates, names of people I spoke to. I treated the situation the way I treated my job: thoroughly, accurately, without complaint. What no one noticed was that my silence had shifted again. Before, silence had been an accommodation. Then it became observation. Now, it was execution. I didn't ask my family questions because questions invite answers, and answers can muddy timelines. I needed the situation to unfold exactly as it had been set in motion. I needed responsibility to land where it legally belonged, not where emotion redirected it. So I stayed calm, present, ordinary. I attended events. I listened. I nodded. I didn't hint at what I knew. I didn't test reactions. I didn't seek reassurance. And because nothing about me changed outwardly, no one suspected anything was moving underneath. That's the danger of underestimating quiet people. You assume stillness means inaction. In reality, it often means focus. I took care of my own stability next, reviewed budgets, adjusted timelines, ensured that whatever happened next, I would not be cornered into urgency or desperation. Financial pressure is most effective when someone has no room to breathe. I made sure I could breathe. I also made one internal shift that mattered more than anything else. I released the need to be understood. That was harder than any paperwork. There is a powerful temptation, when you're wronged quietly, to want recognition, an apology, an acknowledgement, proof that your pain was seen. But recognition is not required for resolution. I let go of the idea that this would end in emotional clarity. I accepted that others might be confused, might feel blindsided, might genuinely not understand how things reach this point. That didn't change the facts. As weeks passed, consequences began moving through channels I wasn't part of anymore. Notices were sent, timelines progressed, systems did what systems do when names and responsibilities are clearly assigned. Still, no one called me. That told me something important. My role as a buffer was already dissolving. The moment I stopped absorbing quietly, discomfort began to spread outward instead of inward. I didn't interfere with that. Silence in this phase wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about integrity. I was no longer covering for anyone, not actively, not passively. I was simply allowing reality to surface on its own schedule. And while nothing had exploded yet, the shape of what was coming had already changed. The smoothness everyone was used to, the ease of assuming I would handle it, was gone. They just hadn't noticed yet. By the time they did, the story would no longer be about intentions or misunderstandings. It would be about outcomes. Consequences rarely arrive with drama. More often, they show up as confusion. The first sign wasn't a confrontation, it was a shift in tone. A phone call that ended more abruptly than usual. A message that carried a hint of urgency where there had once been ease. I noticed it immediately. Someone asked me a question that had never been asked before. Did you get any mail recently? I answered honestly, but narrowly. Yes. I didn't elaborate. Silence, at this stage, wasn't about concealment. It was about not correcting a system that had functioned without my input for years. I wasn't obligated to manage anyone else's emotional response to consequences they hadn't included me in. Soon after, another call came, then another. Each one is slightly more strained than the last. Not angry, concerned, confused. Things that had always been handled were suddenly unclear. What struck me was how quickly discomfort spread once it no longer had a place to land. For years, I had absorbed uncertainty, smoothed over risk, and quietly fixed issues before they became visible. Without that buffer, even small disruptions felt alarming to those who had grown used to stability without effort. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reassure. Reassurance, I had learned, is another form of absorption. At family gatherings, conversations circled the same topics repeatedly: logistics, timelines, strange letters. No one looked at me directly when these things were mentioned. My name hovered unspoken, like a door no one was sure they were allowed to open. I said nothing. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. For the first time, the experience matched the structure. Decisions made without me were now unfolding without my intervention. The emotional labor I had once provided freely was no longer available by default. And that absence was felt. I noticed something else too, something more uncomfortable. The confusion wasn't paired with self reflection. No one asked, "How did this happen?" in a way that implied shared responsibility. The question was always, "Why is this happening now?" That told me everything I needed to know. When people are used to someone carrying the weight, they interpret the weight's return as an anomaly rather than a correction. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. When directly asked factual questions, I answered them. When clarification was needed, I provided it. But I didn't step ahead of the process. I didn't anticipate needs. I didn't volunteer solutions. I stayed exactly where I was, present, calm, neutral. And that neutrality unsettled them more than anger ever could have. Because anger would have given them something to respond to, something to negotiate. Neutrality offered nothing but reality. Behind the scenes, timelines continued. Notifications escalated. Systems, indifferent to family dynamics, moved forward according to their own rules. I watched it happen with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness, Because this didn't need to be painful if it had been handled transparently from the beginning. Relief, because I was no longer distorting myself to keep everything intact. The consequences weren't catastrophic, they were clarifying. Comfort gave way to accountability. Assumptions dissolved. The absence of my quiet labor revealed how much of the structure had depended on it. And still, I said nothing more than necessary. Because the point was never to be heard. The point was to stop being used. The shift from confusion to panic was subtle, but unmistakable. It began with urgency, disguised as friendliness. Messages that opened with concern and ended with requests. Phone calls that lingered longer than usual. A tone that suggested something needed to be cleared up quickly. I recognized it immediately. This was the phase where people realized something was wrong, but still believed it could be reversed if they acted fast enough. Someone finally asked directly, "Why didn't you say anything?" It wasn't accusatory, it was almost pleading, as if my silence had been the missing piece that caused all of this. I answered carefully. I wasn't informed. That was it. No explanation. No elaboration, just the truth, stated without heat. What followed was a rush of justifications. Not apologies, justifications. Explanations framed around intention, around stress, around how complicated everything had been at the time, how they thought I knew, how they assumed I was okay with it. Assumptions, again. I listened. I let them speak until the words ran out. I didn't interrupt to correct details. I didn't argue timelines. I didn't raise my voice. When they finished, there was a pause, a heavy one. Then came the pivot. What can we do now? That question carried an expectation I recognized immediately. That I would step back into the role, that I would fix it, that I would help unwind the consequences now that they were uncomfortable. And that was the moment it became too late. Not because I was unwilling to help, but because helping would have required me to absorb the cost again. Financially, emotionally, structurally. I said calmly, "I'm handling my part through the proper channels." They didn't like that answer, not because it was unreasonable, but because it removed the option of informal resolution. It meant the situation would continue unfolding without the cushioning of family dynamics. It meant accountability would follow documentation, not negotiation. The panic intensified after that. Suddenly, timelines mattered, details mattered. People scrambled for options that had existed earlier but were now closed. They wanted meetings, conversations, clarifications. They wanted access. What they didn't want was the system. But the system doesn't care about regret. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind anyone of past moments. I didn't point to my notebook or recite a list of times I had been overlooked. I didn't need to. The facts were doing that work for me. At some point, frustration surfaced. Not rage, resentment. The quiet kind that asks, "Why are you being like this?" That question hurt more than anything else because it revealed how deeply my role had been misunderstood. How my boundaries, once asserted, were perceived as a change in personality rather than a correction of imbalance. I answered honestly, "I'm not being anything. I'm just not absorbing this." There was nothing left to fix informally after that. Doors that could have been opened earlier remained closed. Options that relied on my cooperation no longer existed. The situation moved fully out of the personal realm and into the procedural one. And in that space, intentions don't matter. Only names, dates, signatures. By the time everyone understood that, the window had closed. Not because I slammed it shut, but because it had never been theirs to open without me. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone expected. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations. Just a conversation that had been postponed for years, now stripped of urgency and emotion. We sat at a table, neutral space, neutral time. I brought copies of documents, neatly organized, not as a threat, but as a reference. I wasn't there to accuse, I was there to clarify. They spoke first. There was an attempt at an apology, not fully formed but present. It came wrapped in explanations, stress, confusion, assumptions made under pressure. They said they hadn't meant for me to carry the burden alone, that they thought I understood, that they believed everything would work out. I listened. When they finished, I didn't respond immediately. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to give the moment the weight it deserved. Then I said calmly, "Intent doesn't replace consent." The sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. I explained, without emotion, how my name had been used, how responsibility had been assigned without my knowledge, how the consequences had reached me only after systems had already begun responding. I didn't use the word betrayal. I didn't describe how it felt. I didn't accuse anyone of malice. I described the structure. I told them that the issue wasn't trust, it was access, that my reliability had been treated as permission, that my silence had been misread as agreement, that what had happened wasn't a misunderstanding, but a failure to include me in decisions that carried legal weight. They tried to return to emotion, to family, how hurtful the situation had become. I didn't dismiss that. I said, "I understand this is uncomfortable, but discomfort doesn't undo responsibility." That was the turning point. The conversation shifted from persuasion to acceptance. Not because they agreed with everything I said, but because they realized I wasn't there to be convinced. I made my boundaries clear. I would not take on additional responsibility beyond what the system required of me. I would not negotiate outcomes that had already been set in motion. I would not be the intermediary between them and the consequences that existed independently of my feelings. What surprised them most wasn't my firmness, it was my calm. They had expected anger, or tears, or bitterness, something they could respond to emotionally. Instead, they faced someone who had already processed the situation privately and arrived with clarity. That kind of calm is unsettling. Before we ended the conversation, I said one last thing, something that mattered more than any document on the table. I didn't stop being quiet. I stopped being available without consent. No one argued with that, because there was nothing to argue against. The confrontation ended without resolution in the emotional sense. There was no closure, bow tied neatly around it. But there was an understanding, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps incomplete, that something fundamental had changed. Not just the situation, the role. What changed afterward wasn't my life in obvious ways. I didn't move cities. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I didn't reinvent myself. From the outside, I'm still the same person, same job, same quiet routines, same preference for calm over chaos. But internally, everything has a different center of gravity. I no longer measure my worth by how smoothly things run around me. I no longer confuse usefulness with belonging. I no longer offer access to my time, my resources, or my name simply because it keeps things comfortable for others. That doesn't mean I'm cold. It means I'm precise. I still help when I choose to. I still care. I still show up. But now every yes is intentional. Every agreement is informed. Every silence is chosen, not inherited from habit or expectation. The exhaustion I once carried has faded. Not because life is easier, but because I'm no longer leaking energy into roles I didn't consent to. I don't scan rooms for unspoken needs anymore. I don't preemptively fix things to avoid discomfort. I let adults handle their own responsibilities unless they ask and unless I agree. That shift alone has been transformative. Some relationships feel different now, slightly more distant, slightly more formal. That's not a loss, it's alignment. The relationships that relied on my unspoken labor have had to adjust. Some have, some haven't. And that's okay. I've learned that clarity can feel like rejection to people who benefited from ambiguity. That boundaries can feel like betrayal to those who were never aware of crossing them. I don't take that personally anymore. The most surprising change is how calm I feel about money and responsibility now. Because nothing could go wrong, but because I trust myself to respond clearly if it does. I understand systems better. I understand my rights. I understand where my name appears and where it doesn't. That knowledge is grounding. I still keep my notebook, not because I expect trouble, but because it reminds me that my perception matters. Those patterns are real, even when they're subtle. That quiet people still deserve consent. I don't regret how I handled things. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I didn't retaliate. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't raise my voice or seek revenge. I simply stepped out of a role that had been assigned to me without permission. And once I did that, everything else followed naturally. If there's a single lesson I carry forward, it's this. Calm is powerful when it's chosen. Silence is strength when it's intentional. And being underestimated is not a weakness. It's time. I'm still quiet, but I'm no longer available by default. There's a certain kind of story we are taught to expect when someone is wronged. It usually ends with confrontation, anger, or some form of dramatic justice. Someone raises their voice. Someone storms out. Someone finally wins. This wasn't that kind of story. Nothing exploded. No one was humiliated. There was no moment where everyone suddenly understood and apologized perfectly. What happened instead was quieter and, in many ways, more lasting. I stopped paying a price no one had acknowledged. That's the moral at the center of this story. Not that the family can't hurt you, not that trust is impossible, but that harm doesn't need to be loud to be real, and boundaries don't need to be loud to be effective. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant being generous, that being reasonable meant being flexible, that keeping the peace meant carrying more than my share. And because I didn't object, the cost became invisible, even to the people who benefited from it. But silence given automatically is not kindness, it's access. And when access is granted without consent, responsibility drifts toward the person least likely to resist it. The moment I understood that, everything changed. I didn't change who I was. I didn't harden. I didn't become suspicious or vengeful. I simply became deliberate. I let systems do what systems do. I let facts speak where emotions would only confuse. I allowed discomfort to land where it belonged instead of absorbing it quietly. That's not cruelty, that's alignment. If you're someone who's often described as easygoing, dependable, or the one who doesn't mind, I want you to hear this clearly. Your calm is not a blank check. Your silence is not permission. Your reliability does not obligate you to carry consequences you didn't choose. You're allowed to pause. You're allowed to ask. You're allowed to say no without explanation. And if someone only feels close to you when you're useful, that closeness was conditional all along. This story isn't an invitation to cut people off or burn bridges. It's an invitation to notice patterns before they harden into roles, to trust your discomfort as information, to understand that quiet strength isn't about endurance, it's about clarity. Sometimes justice doesn't look like victory. Sometimes it looks like finally stepping out of the way and letting reality land where it should have from the beginning. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever found yourself quietly carrying things no one else seemed to notice, I'd really like to hear your experience. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that what you thought was keeping the peace was actually costing you more than anyone knew? Share your thoughts in the comments.